Welcome to The Explainer. We tend to think of the Bible as this single timeless book. But what if I told you it was actually born from a century of crisis, forged in the fires of some pretty intense debates, and assembled by communities who were grappling with the very soul of their faith? Today, we're going to go back to the 2nd century and uncover the surprising and very human story of how the Bible actually came to be. So, let's dive in. Okay, so this was the burning question for Christianity in the 2nd century. The apostles, the direct links to Jesus, were gone. And yet, this new faith was exploding across the Roman Empire. Just imagine a startup going viral, but without a mission statement. I mean, it's thrilling, right? But it's also a recipe for absolute chaos. How do you keep the story straight when everyone seems to have their own version? So, without those original leaders, the early Christian communities were trying to navigate a pretty confusing new world. Suddenly, there was just this flood of new texts. We're talking dozens of gospels, letters, and so-called secret revelations. And all of them were claiming to be the real deal, all claiming the authority of the apostles. Can you imagine trying to build a global movement with no official guidebook? That was the challenge they were facing. From Rome all the way to Alexandria, communities were asking the same things. Which stories about Jesus can we actually trust? Which letters should guide our lives? They needed a shared foundation, a definitive collection. They needed what the Greeks called a canon. Right, so the word canon literally means a measuring stick. It was the yardstick they needed to figure out which writings were authentic and authoritative. But here's the thing. To build this new bookshelf of Christian scripture, they didn't just start from scratch. Nope. They looked to the secret texts they already knew and revered. We have to remember, the very first Christians were Jews. So for them, their sacred scripture was the Hebrew Bible. This collection of the law, the prophets, and the writings, well, that formed the absolute bedrock of their faith. It was the foundation for everything that would come next, for what they would later call the Old Testament. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The early Christians adopted the Hebrew scriptures, and they mostly read them in a super popular Greek translation called the Septuagint. But they didn't just copy and paste. They also included other texts that were widely read at the time, books like Tobit and Maccabees, which, by the way, weren't part of the final Jewish canon. This was really the first step in creating a uniquely Christian collection of scriptures. So they had their foundation, but alongside these ancient scriptures, a whole new wave of writing started showing up. Gospels telling the story of Jesus, and letters from the apostles that were guiding these new communities. The big question was, how did these new, unproven texts become, well, scripture? This wasn't some top-down decision from a committee sitting in Rome, not at all. It was more like a grassroots movement. Over decades, a consensus just sort of emerged organically. A text would gain authority if it checked a few key boxes. Was it connected to an apostle or someone in their inner circle? Was it being read in churches from Spain to Syria? And crucially, did it actually line up with the core story of Jesus that had been passed down? Guiding this whole organic process was a new generation of leaders we called the Apostolic Fathers. Now, these guys hadn't known Jesus personally, but they had learned directly from the apostles. They really saw themselves as guardians of the flame, protectors of that original message in a world that was changing fast. Think of people like Clement of Rome and Ignatius of Antioch as the original social networkers. Seriously, they were writing letters, traveling thousands of miles, and working tirelessly to connect all these scattered Christian communities. They were trying to build a unified tradition around the apostolic writings, basically weaving a consensus one letter at a time. But that fragile unity, it was about to get torn apart. Right when this fragile consensus was starting to take shape, a bombshell hit the church. A radical new idea popped up that was going to force a choice, and fast. That slow, organic process of forming a canon, it was about to be thrown into hyperdrive. Okay, so the year is 1444 CE. A wealthy shipowner and theologian named Marcion sails into Rome, and he's got a revolutionary proposal. He unveils his own Bible, a streamlined, heavily edited version that would send absolute shockwaves through the entire Christian world. Marcion's core idea was simple and frankly shocking. The God of the Old Testament was not the Father of Jesus Christ. He argued that the vengeful, law-giving God of the Hebrew Scriptures was some lesser deity, totally separate from the loving Father that Jesus revealed. His conclusion? Christians needed to cut all ties with their Jewish roots. Period. So what does Marcion do? He basically takes a butcher's knife to the Scriptures. He throws out the entire Old Testament. gone. He keeps only one gospel, a version of Luke that he heavily edited himself, and 10 of Paul's letters, which he also scrubbed clean of any Jewish influence. Look, this wasn't just a different opinion, this was an existential threat. Marcion was trying to sever Christianity from its very roots. Marcion's challenge was a crisis, for sure, but it was also a catalyst. By forcing the church to confront what it was not, it helped them finally define what it was. The time for ambiguity was over. The church had to draw a line in the sand. The counterattack was led by people like Irenaeus of Lyon, and he argued really passionately that Marcion was missing the whole point. You couldn't just delete the Old Testament. He said it was part one of a single epic story that culminates in Jesus. And to tell that story right, you needed not one, but 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, because each one offered a unique and essential portrait of Jesus. So let's just trace this journey real quick. It starts with the original writings in the 1st century. Then you have the Apostolic Fathers starting to build that consensus. Then, smack in the middle of the 2nd century, Marcion's challenge forces a crisis. And by the end of that century, the church responds, solidifying the core of the New Testament. The crisis didn't create the canon, but it absolutely accelerated its formation. And the result of all that? 27 books. By the end of the 2nd century, the core of the New Testament as we know it today was pretty much in place, accepted by churches all the way from Britain to Persia, a shared library for a global faith. So what's the big takeaway here? It's that the Bible has a history. It wasn't just zapped down from heaven, fully formed. It was forged in the messy, dynamic, and very human process of a growing faith. It's the product of generations of communities wrestling with this huge question. How do we preserve the story of Jesus for the world? So the books were chosen, the canon was closed. But in a lot of ways, the story was just getting started. The debate over what these texts actually mean, well, that would echo through the centuries, shaping empires, sparking revolutions, and transforming billions of lives. But that is a story for another time. Thanks for joining us on The Explainer.